Offshore wind has unlimited potential. But why even consider to go offshore when it appears to be more challenging and more expensive than just staying onshore?
We believe that offshore wind energy will be the next big thing, simply because offshore wind has massive opportunities and unlimited possibilities in the long run. If you look at the development of onshore wind from its early stages and up until today, we can expect the same from offshore. Tremendous progress has already been made, and as the market matures and grows, we can expect to see the costs of offshore come down. Well, you should consider to go offshore if, for example, you're facing constraints on land which limit your potential to tap into the full extent of onshore wind. And also if you have the appropriate conditions for offshore wind, then obviously it makes sense to consider to go offshore. There's unlimited potential at sea, and it makes sense to utilize this vast potential. You can see I'm standing here onshore, and the wind is barely noticeable. But you can see out at offshore, by the way our wind turbines are running, the winds are much stronger, much steadier offshore. If you do not have the appropriate offshore wind resource available or site conditions for offshore, then it does not make sense to go offshore. The largest potential for offshore wind as we see it is typically in the low depth areas of the North Sea, the Atlantic Ocean, the Baltic Seas. We see huge growth opportunities in these areas for offshore wind. A study was made where it showed around the British Isles, if the UK tapped into 29% of the practical offshore resource available, the UK could become a net exporter of renewable electricity from offshore wind. We've seen from onshore wind first movers like Denmark, Germany and Spain create significant numbers of jobs from being the first mover in the onshore wind market. Now with offshore wind, we're seeing countries want to take on this first mover advantage and create significant jobs. Without offshore wind, for example, here in Europe, it will be very difficult for EU member states to meet their European renewables obligations.
Occasionally, statements pop up stating that offshore wind energy might harm marine life. But is that the truth or just a myth?
Naturally, during the construction and installation phase of offshore wind projects, fish, other marine life will disappear. But evidence has also shown that the fish and marine life actually reappear when the projects have completed, and the foundations act as an artificial reef for marine life.
Another statement that often crops up is that offshore wind energy is too expensive. But is that just a myth, or do the facts and figures tell a different story?
Another debate and another myth out there is the cost of offshore wind. Some maintain it being too expensive. But this debate about the cost of offshore wind is very often very confusing. On the one hand, we have high installation capex costs, much higher than for onshore wind, and this is for good reason. We're much further out at sea, deep waters, more challenging environment with limited weather windows. But what's key here is offshore we have stronger winds, steadier winds. We can build larger turbines with much larger rotor diameters, where we can capture much more energy production from those turbines. And so it's the cost of energy that's key. That's the only relevant measure for offshore wind. Offshore wind is in its infancy and it's maturing. But as it matures and progresses up the learning curve, we see that gap between on and offshore wind narrow, and we expect to see in the future cost reductions for offshore wind.
Offshore wind has become the next natural step for many countries in renewable energy. But if policymakers want to develop an offshore wind market, where do you start? And how do you get it going?
For a start, you may want to look at doing a spatial planning exercise, mapping out what's actually possible off your coast. As a second natural step, you could look at developing the planning regime, the consenting process, the grid regime. How are we going to build electricity grids offshore to get the power from the projects back to the coast, to the populations? It is key that the governments put in place transparent, long-term and certain stable public policies That will allow the offshore wind market to prosper. It will allow and help industry reduce costs because the industry will have much more confidence to invest, bring in competition, standardization, optimization as the market matures.
Several governments have already kick-started markets for offshore wind. But can their offshore wind ambitions be realised without government intervention? Or do policymakers need to take action? And what does it take if a country wants to benefit from their full offshore wind potential?
There are many things governments can do to drive offshore wind even further. For example, supporting the industry by investing and upgrading in port infrastructure, which is necessary to get these large offshore projects off the ground. By ensuring the offshore electricity grid is in place to bring the power back from these projects to the coast, by ensuring there's a framework in place where the consenting process is streamlined to ensure we don't have long permitting approval timelines. Governments can also play a role in helping industry to reduce costs, for example, by providing funding support for R&D investments, and that will help us reduce the cost of energy for offshore wind, which is in the interest of society.